Welcome to Wonders and Miracles podcast, where we celebrate miraculous moments in everyday lives. I'm Liza Lawrence. I'm glad to have you join me as we celebrate wonders and miracles together. All right. Well, today I am here with Doug Cornfield and Dave Clark, and I'm excited to visit with these two men. They're involved in a lot of amazing things. Dave's going to share his story of getting polio and growing up with a disability. And he is the only professional baseball player to pitch and play from crutches. He's a true role model for his dream and do attitude. Dave has been a coach, a manager, a scout, and owner at the highest levels of professional baseball during his 40-plus year career in sports. He's an author and an inspirational speaker. So I'm excited to hear more of your story, Dave. And Doug is the director of D3, which he'll talk about. And before joining Dave Clark, Doug was a scholarship athlete at the University of Georgia, VP at Nest Entertainment, and senior financial advisor at Merrill Lynch. Doug was the driving force to adding D3 to several states in the U.S., and he's a speaker and recent author of the children's book, A Pound of Kindness, which is Dave's story. And it's a beautiful children's book. I taught preschool and kindergarten, and so I love children's books. And this was such a beautiful, beautiful story that really touched my heart. So I'm excited to have you both on here. Doug is from New York and Dave is from Florida. However, they're both in Florida today to talk to me, and I'm excited for that. So go ahead and share your story and some of the things you've been involved in.
I'll start because my son Gideon was born with neither arm developed. And he's got a short arm to about half of what an elbow length would be, about halfway down, with 3 fingers and 2 function. And his right arm is virtually non-existent. And so when you're thrust into the disability world, I have 7 children. He was our 5th child. And all of a sudden, your world kind of changes a little bit. And flash forward about a year and a half, 2 years later, we were living down in Atlanta, Georgia, my family and I, with 5 kids. And we were moving back to my wife's hometown of Corning, New York. And during that time, actually in Atlanta, I picked out a newspaper and I read about this man who pitched from crutches, and he was getting the Heroes of Sports Award, a national award presented to him. All the ESPN, Nike guys, all that kind of stuff were there. And his story all of a sudden didn't make any sense to me. I was looking at this, reading this article, how does a 5'2" guy play any professional sport on crutches, let alone professional baseball? So the story didn't make sense to me. And what really, as you would say, as the winds of God or the winds of force nature pulled this all together, Dave is actually from, and this is what the article said, from my wife's hometown of Corning, New York,
Wow.
Which is only about 10,000 people big. And so, whatever we want to cause that winds of force, I have an athletic background myself, as kind of my bio stated, but my father was a world-class athlete, and I was around, world-class athletes from the time I was a little boy, even meeting the likes of Jesse Owens when I was a child. And so when I read Dave's story, it literally made no sense to me. And that he was from Corning, New York made less sense. And as it would be, again, as the winds blew us together, Dave had just finished a 10-year career of coaching in the major leagues of Sweden. But due to what's called now post-polio and atrophying of his muscles and things like that, he felt like he just couldn't continue to coach at the level he was coaching. And he had a home in Corning. And so my family of 5 at the time was converging on Corning. He was doing some part-time coaching at that time, also scouting for, I believe, San Diego. And we met with my son Gideon in my arms at a baseball field, of all things. And I wanted to meet him because, as a father of a child with limitations, I asked Dave to meet. I wanted to pick his brain, so to speak. Of course, then I got to see what I get to see a lot now, which is, I don't want to call it a twinkle in his eye, but let's just call it a twinkle in his eye when he sees kids with limitations like Gideon. So if you can imagine me, in my 30s or whatever I was at the time, carrying around a 2-year-old with no arms, coming up to this man on crutches coaching a baseball team, asking him if we could talk and meet. Just put all that together. And of course, Dave said absolutely, gave me a cell phone. A couple weeks later, we had breakfast together. And the one thing that I remember from that breakfast that I tell people is that when I stopped asking questions of Dave, his response was to me, nobody had ever asked him questions like this before. Because I was coming from a father wanting to know what his parents did.
Yeah.
And so that was the real significant difference, I think, of our meeting. And, and I'll let him take over, but it's that kind of inspiration that I needed as a father. Now, I didn't know I was going to be traveling all over the country with the man at the time. I didn't know, we were going to be doing sports camps. I was actually working at Merrill Lynch with my two older brothers, but I got to know his story. And the more I got to know his story, and he started putting the pieces and peeling back the onions of the layers and layers and layers of this story, I eventually said, this should be a movie. Okay. And 10 years later, I left Merrill Lynch to do what we do now. So without further ado, I'd rather introduce Dave so people can hear some of his stories. And I personally love him to tell, when you're talking about God moments, if he would start off with telling the story of a young first grade classmate of his named Ernie Pound.
Before I do that, I want to go back to that meeting with Doug, because I had I call them the best parents that you could have had, given my situation, and brothers as well, because I was not treated any differently than anyone else. And I think that's so key to someone with limitations, that you don't limit them. And typically we do.
Yeah.
Because we box them. And when I say we, the person that's in charge of the little guy growing up that doesn't have everything that everyone else has, we typically overprotect. And that's a thing I try to get across at our camps when I speak to the parents and caregivers prior to starting, is that every one of us has some type of potential. You never know what that potential is unless you're let loose to find out what it is. And so my parents did that. And that's what I told Doug at that meeting. I said, my parents really didn't treat me any different. I tell the story all the time. I wanted to play ice hockey. I know my mom didn't want me to play ice hockey. And I remember her telling me, all right, go play ice hockey. But the minute you come home without a tooth, that's when you're going to stop. So thank God I never lost a tooth playing ice hockey. Those were the things. They let me go like any other kid. And back in the day when I was growing up, totally different world. Our parents had no idea where we were.
Yes.
You'd be home at 6 for dinner. We had the freedom to explore and find out what we were good at, what we were not good at. And I emphasize that point to the pro athletes I speak with. A lot of the coaches I had across my career would always emphasize, work on your weaknesses and make them better. When I was coaching, I told my players the exact opposite. Take what you're strong at and make it better, because that's what got you here in the first place, is your strengths. If you're working on your weaknesses, you're going to take away time from working on what you're good at. So we all have strengths and weaknesses. And I think discovering what your strengths are key to what you're going to do.
I love that.
Anyway, I got a little sidetracked, but
well, I love that message. I teach child development actually at a university. And so we talk a lot about parenting. And that is, I think, a beautifully important message for parents, to not limit your children.
My parents, again, were vital in teaching me that. But there's a teacher that impacted me tremendously as well. Anyway, let's fast forward. I'm growing up, not being treated any different than anyone else.
First of all, let me ask, how old were you when you got polio?
10 months.
So you were a baby.
Yeah, and let me go back to that for a moment, because I always say that was very key. I feel that a key to where my life went was the fact that I had not learned how to walk yet.
Oh, interesting.
So it was just barely, 10 months old, just barely on the verge of starting to, and I got hit with polio. So I didn't have to transition or make
Right.
adjustments. I was taken away from my parents for a year. I was put into a reconstruction hospital that dealt with polio victims. The first meeting with the doctors there, they told my parents, Dave may not live.
Wow.
And then 2 weeks later, we believe he's going to make it through, but he's not going to be anything more than a vegetable. He'll never have use of his muscles. And then a year later, I came out walking with crutches and leg braces. At that point, I had 2 full-length leg braces, one of which I took off against doctor's orders later in life. But that's how I started life. But for me, that was my norm. So growing up, my brothers didn't treat me any different. We had fights, mom and dad took care of us the best way they knew how. And again, I was not prevented from doing anything my brothers were doing. So we played sandlot ball, and we were in the neighborhood. 10 kids in the neighborhood were outside all the time playing. When I got to school, that changed. That was my first experience of being made to feel different, was attending school. I got bullied because I walked differently. I did things differently. I may have gotten accomplished like anybody else, but I did it differently.
Right.
And so I was bullied. I was picked on. So in first grade, the teacher announced a walking field trip to the local fire station about 5 blocks away. All the kids were happy. We were going to get out of school for the day. No books, no reading, none of that stuff. But I took a different angle on it. It scared the heck out of me because I knew the bullies were going to make me pay a price. I was going to slow the class down. So that weighed on me heavily. And she announced this trip 2 weeks in advance, which was a big mistake for me because every day the anxiety levels grew and grew and grew. And I was about to explode the day of the actual trip. And I even tried to start coughing at home that day. I woke up and Mom's sick, Mom. Mom knew all my tricks. And she said, get dressed, you're going to school.
Moms are smart that way.
Yeah. So off to school I went, not feeling good. So I get to school and I'm trembling a little bit. And the teacher says, all right, let's line up. We're getting ready to go. So I did the only thing my 6-year-old brain could think about doing. I went to the very end. I waited till everybody lined up and I went to the end of the line thinking that if everybody took off and they were walking, I'd lag behind. But if they didn't look back, I'd eventually catch up with them and maybe I could get away without being picked on and bullied. So that's the situation. And then the teacher said, all right, let's go. And just before she said that, little 6-year-old classmate named Ernie Pound came up to me and he said, Dave, I brought my radio flyer wagon today to pull you on the field trip. Jump in if you like. Wow, savior.
Yes.
You talk about those moments that we talked about. That was one of them. Ernie changed the whole course of that day. He made the day be fun. Then all the kids in the class started wanting to pull Dave. And it became a fun day for everybody. Even the bullies wanted to take a turn pulling me. So it changed the whole course of that day. And I like to say maybe my life, because it showed me that not everybody was a bully. It also showed me it's not fun to be bullied and there are nice people. And if you got a choice, be one of the Ernie Pounds. Ernie moved away after first grade. I never saw him again. But when my career ended and a sports writer wanted to write a book about my career, I included a story about that incident in my book. And I never forgot Ernie's name. And I thanked him in the book. Never in my wildest dreams thinking that I would see him again. I'm going to let Doug take it from here.
So being a father with special needs and now being a friend of Dave for several years, getting to know more of his story and finding out all these crazy things that he did in his life and that are just really, almost too incredible to believe in many cases. I'm reading that story in my office. It's in chapter 2. The title is actually called My Saviors. A small s kind of saviors, but it's my saviors.
I love that.
The people that saved him. And I remember reading that before the book was even published because I was helping him get it to the publisher and all those things. And then now I'm reading the book during a time when I had set up 5 different book signings for him in our local little area. At the YMCA, at a coffee shop, at one of our favorite old world cafes in beautiful Corning, New York, those kind of things. And I'm rereading this book and it hits me again. Every time I read this little story, I get the goosebumps. And I'm not the crying type, but it gets me, every time. And I'm sitting here reading it, and I went to the phone book. And this might be the last time I've ever gone to a phone book, because I remember Googling him, but couldn't find any Ernie Pounds or anything. This is, 10, 12 years ago now. So I find a phone book, and there's an Ernst Pound in the phone book. And I call it, but it's calling from my office. So at that time, he's probably seeing Merrill Lynch come up on his caller ID. Doesn't want to talk to me. You can just feel that kind of energy over the phone. And I asked him if he had gone to first grade in Corning. And he literally doesn't even want to answer the questions. He's going, oh, I think maybe I did, but he didn't want to answer. And I told him about Dave's story. I said, I think if it's you're thanked in a book by one of your classmates from first grade, and it might be something you don't even remember.
Wow.
And I told him, you brought a radio flyer wagon to school to pull my friend, Dave Clark. And he goes, I remember the wagon. Didn't know what Dave had gone on to do, had left the area. His family actually moved to California and then settled back in the Finger Lakes of Watkins Glen area in Odessa, New York. He's about the shyest guy in the world. So now that I look back at it and then he came to the book signing, I'm still kind of a little bit of amazed. But he walked into the coffee shop. This is the Heavenly Cup Coffee Roasters, which hopefully we make famous someday. And he walks into this coffee shop, and I saw him, and I knew it was him.
You did.
I just knew it. It was that spiritual, whatever you want, a connection. He walked in. He was with his son, and there was a lot of people lined up. And I literally go up to him and I said, "Are you Ernie Pound?" And he goes, "Yes." And I handed him a book. We still had hardcover books back then. I handed him a book. I said, Dave's just going to want you to have this. But do me a favor, when you get up to Dave, just when he asks you who to sign this to, just tell him Ernie Pound. And of course, I got my video camera ready. And he comes up, puts a book underneath Dave's nose. And I did capture that on video. So people can go to our websites, apoundofkindness.net or .com, and they can pull that up and see this video of these 2 men after 45 years of not seeing each other being reunited. And kind of a side story, my wife was in that coffee shop with Dave's wife that day. And let's just say Dave got a little teary-eyed. Dave's wife, Camilla, shares with my wife that day, and they've been together, I don't know, probably 10, 12, 15 years at this point. She told my wife she had never seen her husband cry before.
Wow.
And gets teary-eyed now all the time when we talk about this story.
Like Doug said, the emotions flew pretty naturally, I should say, because I didn't expect to, to gush tears or anything. But, when you're sitting there and you are looking up at a person, who should I sign this to? And they tell you, and you put your head back down, you sign it. And then all of a sudden, the guy says, Ernie Pound. All the years got washed away, and you went back to the feelings that you had at that moment in time, the first grade, when the anxiety was lifted off my shoulder, and it was great to be able to express to him what that meant to me.
Yeah.
And we've stayed in touch now.
It's just a little thing. We called the children's book A Pound of Kindness, kind of in honor of Ernie Pound.
And I think we underestimate the importance of those kind acts that we do for other people and what an impact that made in your life. And he probably had no idea how important that was for you.
Well, just think about that act, 45, now 55 years later. It had an impact that day on Dave. It had an impact of teaching the importance of inclusion, because now Dave felt included with his classmates and not left out. It obviously took off a tremendous burden that he was feeling at the time as a 6-year-old with the heavy braces and crutches. And it made it a simple fun day, so much so that he shares it 45 years later. And look, flash forward, what are we talking about today? And we've shared this story, it hasn't gone viral all over the country, but we know that when we do our speaking events, whether they're corporate events or kids events, this is the story people say, oh, that story with the wagon. This is the story that because of that little kind act, it has sparked something that is still literally burning today.
Yeah. And I think those are God moments, because that love that God is transfers into our hearts. That kindness is so powerful. I really believe in the power of kindness. And I think that is your whole message. And, the pound of kindness and pulling each other along is all about those people that make those big differences in our lives. And I think it's nothing short of miraculous, honestly, that we have people like that in our lives.
The real miracle might have happened 2 years later, another act of kindness.
Okay. And I was going to ask about the teacher, but maybe that's what you were referring to.
That's where we're headed. That's definitely
great. Let's go there.
So 2 years flash forward, and
I'm not sure that's an act of kindness.
No, it was.
It was a great
Tough
act.
love.
So after the first story that occurred in the first grade, that didn't stop the bullying entirely. It lessened it up until third grade. Even my own teachers, and specifically the phys ed teachers, would not allow me to participate. And I loved sports. I was playing the neighborhood games and everything, but they would not allow me to participate in gym class. In third grade, the very first time we had gym class at the start of the year, there was a new gym teacher. Had a crew cut, big guy, strapping guy, is a military man. His name was Mr. Bill Snetchler. And the very first activity we did in his class, he would call the group together and he would tell you what you were going to do. And he'd clap and say, let's go. And that's what all the gym teachers did. The difference being that prior to this, there was a chair over on the sideline. That was for me. So when they clapped the hands, I got conditioned to just automatically go. Well, that day, Mr. Snetchler clapped his hands and I did my routine and there was no chair there. And I took a few more steps thinking he just forgot the chair. And all of a sudden I heard this big booming voice, where do you think you're going? And I was like, oh, wow. And I started look around. I'm shaking a little bit. I know I'm going over. And he told me something that really resonated and stuck with me to this day. I turned around. He came over and he looked at me and he said, where are you going? I said, well, I'm going over here to sit and watch. He said, you're not going to watch in my class. He said, there may be some things that we're going to do this year that you're not going to be able to do. But you're never going to know what those are until you try them. And you are going to try everything we do in this class. So the activity that day was climbing the rope to the ceiling. I was like, oh, man, what an activity to start with. And this is a learning moment and a teaching moment too, because I really doubted myself. And when you have doubts, you can't let that interfere with at least trying. I had to try because he told me. So my turn came and I looked up, and in my own little 8-year-old brain, I'm going, there's no way I'm getting up there. And walking with crutches builds your upper body. And unknown to me, I had quite a bit of upper body strength at that time and arm strength. And so I just I did the only thing I knew how to do. I put one fist over the other and I started elevating myself off the ground and pretty soon I'm looking down, I'm like 3/4 of the way up the rope and I'm tired. This is good enough. And then I said, no, it isn't. Took a break. I said, you're gonna finish this. And I went and I got to the top. Now I had a problem because I had to get down. And normally you would make that little S with your feet to help slow the slide. I couldn't do that. I had 2 braces that weighed 10 pounds. So I went down in a hurry. and I burned the living heck out of my hands with rope burn. But when I got to the bottom, the kids were I was the only kid in the class to get to the top. And all of a sudden that burn was the best burn feeling I've ever had. And then Mr. Snetchler gave me an ice cream bar for being the only kid to get to the top. And I always said, that's my first professional payoff. So what he told me that day came true of the very first thing I ever did. You never know what you can do until you try it. And even if you got doubts, still try it, because you don't know until you do. And then give it all you got, because no dream is impossible to achieve. And then the next activity we did in Mr. Snetchler's class was baseball. I was already pretty much a natural. Well, I don't want to say a natural, but I had played before, and I was able to hone my skills to the point where now I wanted to play Little League. Little League wouldn't let me play, even back then, insurance reasons. He's going to get hurt. Williamsport, Pennsylvania is the birthplace and the world offices of Little League are in Williamsport, Pennsylvania. It's an hour drive from our house in Corning. My parents literally drove to Williamsport and went to bat for me, literally. Wow. And I got to play Little League. And I started realizing I can hold my own with kids that don't have limitations. And that started the dream. And the rest, as they say, is history.
That's amazing. And take us further into your career, because that's how it started. And then where has your career taken you? Because it really is amazing.
So we have 3 hours.
That's a really tough question. But I played up through the ranks. And when I got about, I want to say 14, 15, I was holding my own against competition in Corning, New York. But Corning, New York is, like Doug said, a town of 10,000 people. So I really didn't know how my talent stacked up against the rest of the country. But at 14 or 15, I started thinking about, I really want to take this as far as I can. I was afraid to tell my own parents, even though they supported me all along. And even though I now know that my own mom doubted me. So I didn't tell my parents this. And then I also knew at that point, I always had a mind that figured out what positions and what sport I could play based on my strengths. What gave me the best chance for success? Well, in baseball, I wasn't going to be an outfielder. Couldn't run that fast. I wasn't going to be a middle infielder. So it became first base and pitching. So when I got 14 or so, I realized I could throw the ball right where I want it. I am great at hitting the catcher's mitt wherever he puts it, but I don't throw 90. So I had to start going, okay, what can I do to set myself apart? And I developed a knuckleball. So I started experimenting with a knuckleball, different grips, different release points, different arm angles, found out what worked best for me and stuck with it. So now at 16, I'm thinking, I'm going to try to get somebody interested in giving me a shot.
Wow.
However, I was smart enough, even though Doug will disagree, I was smart enough to know what those odds were. They weren't very good. Who's going to give a guy with crutches and 2 leg braces
at 5'2"
a chance to play professionally? Number one, I went to my doctors who wanted to do I have a scoliosis because of the polio. Well, at 16, a doctor told my parents Dave should have spinal fusion surgery, put 2 rods in his back, straighten him up. Both my brothers are 6 foot. He said it'd probably make him 6 foot. So they contemplated that. And I looked at him and I said, will I be able to go upstairs and ambulate the same way? So now you'll have to relearn things. And I said, can I take my right leg brace off? And he said, absolutely not. He says, well, why do you want to take that off? And I said, well, it gives me more agility and quickness. What do you need that for? And I didn't want to tell him because my parents were there. And I hadn't told them this yet. I think it was the first time they ever heard it. I said, well, I want to try to play professional baseball. And he looked at me like I had a third eye right here. He said, Mr. and Mrs. Clark, whether he has the surgery or not, don't let him take his brace off. We walked out of there and my parents told me this again, greatest parents a guy could ever have. And they looked at me and they said, totally your decision. You have to live with it. So I did not do the surgery. And when we got to the car that day in the parking lot in Rochester, New York, I took my right leg brace off and I haven't worn it since.
Wow.
And, so that's where my parents found out my dream. I remember telling my grandfather what I wanted to do. And he told me, Dave, why don't you get a safe, secure job at the Corning Glass Works? So I didn't listen to him. There were 24 major league teams at the time. And I hand wrote 24 letters, one to each team, expressing what I wanted to do. Would you please give me a chance? That's all I want, just a chance. That's one thing I did. The second thing I did, and I emphasize this point to the pro players and to anyone really, be willing to put in the work without any guarantee that you'll ever get a shot. And that's what I did. I literally ran 5 miles a day on my crutches, lifted weights, rode the stationary bike, did jumping jacks. I did 400 sit-ups a day. I did 200 push-ups a day because I knew I had to outwork anybody to get my chance. So I was doing that all knowing I may never get my opportunity. But if I did, I wanted to be ready. So I got 3 replies out of the 24. I got 1 chance. That was from a Pittsburgh Pirate scout named Art Gaines. And that's where 20 years later, I found that my mom had written him a letter, unknown to me, at that point in time, asking him to let me down very easily. She knew I was having a tryout. She expressed that it was Dave's dream. Please treat him like any other kid, but when the time comes, please let him down easily. And she handed me a letter in 1988 when my playing days had ended. I had just retired after the 88 season. And I looked up at her and there were tears in her eyes. I didn't have a clue what the letter was. She said, read that. And the letter was from Mr. Gaines back to her, telling her that, yes, he will be treated like any other player. And when the time comes for him to go home, if he goes home, we will let him down as easy as possible. That time never came because I made it. But she kept that letter. She actually had it mailed to the neighbor's house. She gave him the neighbor's address to have it mailed to in case I got it by mistake. And she kept that letter all those years, gave it to me. And when I looked up, she was crying. And she just said, I don't know how I ever could have doubted you. That one gets me every time too.
It's so sweet.
So Dave went on to obviously get that contract with the Pittsburgh Pirates minor leagues. Again, he kind of mentioned that he was a knuckleball thrower. And so, but he wound up parlaying that Pittsburgh Pirate opportunity into a 45-year career, but he actually pitched at the minor league level for 10 years. Wow. Again, doing it differently. The knuckleball, for the audience out there, is a ball that is pitched. It's very difficult. That's why it's not used very often, but it's pitched in a way where the ball hardly spins. And because it hardly spins, the wind and the air actually catch the seams and it makes it swirl at random.
Wow.
But Dave had developed this to the point where he had control over the knuckleball and consistency. Well, control sometimes, enough to parlay a 10-year career pitching. And so he bounced around from team to team. His best year was with a very famous team called the Indianapolis Clowns. Again, if the audience doesn't know that team, it was actually part of the original Negro Leagues. It was Hank Aaron's, who just passed away recently. It was Hank Aaron's first team that ever signed him professionally. So Dave played for that team, actually 2 different eras. In 81, he had a 4-year contract, a fairly lucrative contract to go play in the highest level in the Swedish major leagues. I'm giving the summary so that people can understand the depth of all of this.
Yeah.
He started a professional baseball camp in Ocala, Florida that became very successful. He wound up buying the Indianapolis Clowns and running that team from 1985 and playing from 84 to 88 as a coach and a manager and a first baseman for that team, just to keep him on the field. You know, that team they shut down in 1988, and him actually making the last out. It was the last out of not just his career, it was the last out of his career, the Indianapolis Clowns, this famous team that Hank Aaron played on, and it was the last ever out of all of the Negro League teams put together.
Wow.
And this man made that last out. So I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing.
Not a good thing.
But he still owns the rights to the Indianapolis Clowns today and gets a royalty check every once in a while, as small as they are. But, you know, it's a pretty amazing run. And then in the 90s, you know, his 1990 career, he wound up getting a call to actually manage and coach in Sweden. And so he had a 10-year, another segment there, which led a whole other slew of things at the Olympic coach in 1996 for Team USA. And he wound up having a successful run as the manager of the 3-time championship team in the Swedish major leagues.
That's
Getting
amazing.
carried off the field, the whole 9 yards. And there's so many other fun stories about Dave, but it's, when you're talking about, how Dave and I got together, it definitely feels like there was gravitational pulls that are unexplainable. And it's a privilege for me to get to do what I do. And when I first left the Merrill Lynch office to partner with Dave, my focus was, we can do documentaries, we can get him to speak, we can write children's books. I come out of the children's entertainment industry, as my bio would state. I thought we could do all these things, but when we had a meeting, I had just experienced my first ever disability dream and do sports camp with Dave, which was at the spring training facility for the Minnesota Twins with the Minnesota Twins minor league team. Pretty amazing. Every player on the field with these children and young adults with all different situations and disabilities, his inspirational story in front of them, telling them to dream and do, and to not, let their limitations hold them back, and telling the parents, don't hold your kids back, and all these things that were happening at this event. Dave, in our business meeting, asked me, he said, Doug, I know you want to do a movie, and I know you want to do documentaries and books and all this kind of stuff, but what I really want to do is sports camps for kids with disabilities. And so we went to work, and we started approaching some other minor league teams. And before you know it, I couldn't even advertise for our camps because they would get filled up so fast. It's a privilege because I'm getting to introduce a story that most people still don't know. And when they realize it, they're like, oh my. And then when I'm presenting it to a parent specifically who has a young child with limitations or struggles, it gives them hope. It gives them hope to not hold their child back, to let them see how far they can let the rope out, and with wisdom, of course. There's so many situations that are different, whether it's an intellectual challenge or a physical challenge or both. Mm-hmm. But we've gone and worked with the Mets organizations, the Phillies organizations, the Twins organizations, the Colorado Rockies organizations. There's Texas more in there. Rangers. Texas Rangers, are in that loop Yankees. Now. And the Yankees are now going to be in that loop. Tampa Bay has been in that loop. So we've gotten to do this and present this Disability Dream and Do program. And of course, we raise all the money. One of the things that Dave said in that business meeting, hey, if we're going to do these camps, these parents and children will never pay a dime.
Wow.
So we've never charged 1 cent. We raise all of the money for these camps, or we don't do them. And that includes hats and t-shirts and food for 300 people, upwards of tickets to a game. He's really that was his heart. That was the legacy that he wanted to leave. And so we went with it. That didn't mean we don't want to do movie deals and don't want to do books.
Right.
But all of a sudden the books and the movie deal and the documentaries or whatever, it all comes down to how do we raise more money to make these camps and more camps free for kids with disabilities.
I think it's a beautiful purpose. And I think it's probably, I know it would be absolutely life-changing for these children, for sure. I'm sure you've seen many miracles as you've worked with these children in these camps.
Yes, many actually. And even to this day, where like here in Florida, we have a young boy who's Down syndrome and deaf. And he came to a camp 12 years ago, 13 years ago, I don't know, long time ago. And, you know, his parents were a little frustrated because he didn't want to do anything. He just sat on the field and didn't want to do anything. And Dave's attitude is let's just figure out what he wants to do. Let him be. We'll figure it out. And wound up, probably through Dave's leadership, got a player that was in the minor leagues. This is like the minor leagues A. It was a high A level. Got one of the talented young high drafts, came out. His name's Ben Revere. And Ben at that time wound up sitting on the field with Billy and literally just rolled a ball back and forth for about 45 minutes, his mother said. Billy, I believe, either a year and a half ago, they stayed connected all through this time, was just at his wedding. Ben made it to the majors, played with several teams. Yeah. Billy has every one of his jerseys. They've connected. And one of the sweetest things I've ever seen in my life, and I wish I had this on video, we were at a spring training game. Now Ben's at the major league level. He's playing with the Phillies. Yeah. He's playing with the Phillies, but he's away at the Twins Stadium. So you got to know when these guys, when the game's over, they want to get on that bus and they want to get home, girlfriends and wives, they're out of there. But it was a brand new remodel of the stadium. And so where Ben and Billy used to meet, they couldn't get together because of the reconstruction of this stadium. So they hadn't seen each other. So Billy's father takes Billy over to where the bus is going to leave just to wave goodbye to Ben. And this is a huge no-no in Major League Baseball. Just, you don't really understand this unless you're part of the inner club. Ben made the bus driver stop the bus. He walks out of the bus, gives Billy the longest, biggest hug, and walks back on the bus. That's the impact this man has made happen and made connections where I think in one of my promos, we actually say the players get just as much out of this.
I'm
if
seeing
not more,
that.
if
I
not
agree.
More than the participants themselves.
Yes, I think there's huge benefits for both. I can see that. I think it's so beautiful. Tell us a little bit more about some of the other programs you're involved in that you're promoting right now. And by the way, I do think this should be made into a movie. I would like to see that happen.
Well, basically a year and a half ago, or probably a little less, right when COVID was starting to spark. We signed a deal. So we'll see what happens. COVID has put a big break on all of the activities in Hollywood. And that's a huge thing. We hope it happens. I think it should happen. But it's all in timing. But a project that I'm working on right now is based off of the wagon story that we told earlier. And it's a book of 31. We have 31 stories. I wrote a book with a guy named Todd Sivan. It's called Pulling Each Other Along, sharing wonderful stories that are so inspirational of celebrities in some cases, and all these great stories, other people with disabilities that have overcome challenges, people in the sports world, not in the sports world, talking about what pulled them along in their life. And we're really excited about this particular project, with Dave's story and Ernie Pound's story being the inspiration behind this book. And we're going to do a Kickstarter with that as the plan, just working on the covers and getting people's input on the covers and making tweaks. And now it's going to take about 6 weeks to get the final edit. My real hope, if anybody's out there, we need some funding because I've got 6 or 7 more children's books to write. True stories, main child with some kind of limitation, disability, but I do them in high quality Disney style. So they're not cheap, so we have to have the funding before we kind of move ahead with some of those. And when they see the pound of kindness, you'll see it's of the highest quality. So I don't know what we can do here.
So cute.
So there's a pound of kindness, and there's a lot of hidden treasures in here that, people wouldn't know, but because Corning is a glass town and Dave grew up right across from where this tower is still today. It's a glass tower. It's literally how fiber optics was invented, for people that really want to go into. Even his dog Duke. When you're talking about God moments, special moments, I was down here. I had just finished the cover, or not me, because I'm not an artist, but I had the gentleman I picked to do this, Mark Brer, finish the cover. And one of Dave's cousins, Vicky, lives down here in Florida. I'm telling her about the book, and I show her the cover. And she goes, I have some pictures of Dave. Would you want them? And I go, yeah, sure. Just send them to me. And so literally a couple of weeks pass, I get this text of a picture of Dave and his dog Duke that he didn't even know about. We put that in the back of the book.
Cute.
So that people can talk about that story. Because I was pretty blown away of all the things his parents took a studio picture of him and his dog Duke.
That's cute. I love it. Well, this has been just a pleasure to visit with you, and an honor to hear your story and how you guys met. And I think that you're an amazing team together to work with each other and keep pulling each other along.
Well, we appreciate that. And one of the things that we're doing right now is we have kind of some small packages together for schools that would want to have Dave and myself talk about these stories of overcoming inclusion, diversity, disability, all those kind of things. And we have a package where people can buy a box of books and get to have like a 45-minute Zoom of interaction with the only professional baseball player who ever played on crutches, and a polio survivor, so we can talk about the pandemic. And a cancer survivor now too, which is all the different hurdles that we haven't talked about. And so if people are interested in that, probably either d3day.com or apoundofkindness.com, and just click into us or find us on Facebook.
Wonderful. Yeah. And I'll put those on the show notes so people can find that, and on my social media as well, if they want to contact you. I think what you're doing is such a beautiful work. We need that on this earth right now. It feels like there's so much heaviness happening, and to inspire others to be great and to live up to that potential, I think is a beautiful message.
Well, thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to this